Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Drydock, episode 373, part 2, or part B. It's now time to continue with the Patreon questions from October, so let's get stuck in. Elliot W. James asks, Oscar Parks in British Battleships describes the 10-year period beginning in 1877 as the dark ages of the Victorian Navy. Beyond the Treasury, which individuals and factors would you blame for the lack of strategic thinking during this period? Mostly, and this might sound a bit bizarre, there just wasn't a threat for the Royal Navy to kind of think about, to focus in on. Now, obviously, at the time, they'd say, oh, yeah, we have to worry about this and that and the other. But honestly, from the late 1870s onwards, when you have kind of the Drachinifel going on and all that kind of thing, you have this weird period where you're kind of just about getting past what you might call the classical ironclad period. So getting into the period of eventually compound armor, really big guns, and ships that are beginning to look a little bit more like the eventual pre-dreadnought. So this is Camperdown here, for example, an Admiral class from this time period. So you've got all these new and radical technologies, and therefore new and radical potential ship designs. But who are you building against if you're the Royal Navy? Because for literally hundreds of years up until that point, the threat had been France. Except that around about this time period, this is where France goes off on its little je ne sais, we have no money period. And suddenly that big threat isn't there. I mean, yeah, okay, the Russians are a threat, but you're not going to build something the size of the entire 19th century Royal Navy centered around the Russian Baltic Fleet. That would be silly. But who else? You know, the US basically isn't building anything. The Germans are still trying to put together a functioning state and not really in the business of building a massive fleet just yet. The Italians are kind of having fun experimenting, but their fleet isn't particularly big. The Spanish have about 4 ships and a rowboat. You know, there's no one for the Royal Navy to build against, really, in terms of modern new ships. So they're kind of left a little bit meandering, going, well, I guess we could put this new technology together in an interesting and fun way and create this other thing. And this is also kind of what starts off the time period of, hey, look, those guys have built one ship and it's really cool and it's got all these fancy specialist capabilities that theoretically in some areas make it better than what we've got at the moment. Let's build 2 or 3 ships as a direct and specific response to that one particular ship. And everything starts wandering off in all sorts of crazy directions. Then as you start to get towards the end of the 1880s, so about 10 years later, that then France starts to go, actually, maybe the je ne sais thing was a bit of a dumb idea. Let's go back to building capital ships. The Russians pick up the building pace a little bit, and of course other nations like the Germans also start to think about building stuff. The Americans start to think about building stuff, period. The Germans obviously building a bit more stuff. And now suddenly the Royal Navy's like, hey, look, potential threats. We have something to actually point at and go, this is what we want to fight. Yay, now we can build, 8 Royal Sovereigns or something ridiculous like that. And everything's all back on track again. Physical removal enthusiast asks, the Kaiser often travelled aboard his yacht Hohenzollern. I assume he was escorted during his travels by the High Seas Fleet. What was the usual escort for such an occasion? It varied massively. Hohenzollern, incidentally, theoretically could be turned into an auxiliary cruiser in wartime, but usually you wouldn't require a massive escort, or potentially any, for its excursions. Now, sometimes, yes, Hohenzollern would sail with the High Seas Fleet. However, that was because the High Seas Fleet would go on annual exercises and the Kaiser really liked to be part of them. So it was more a case of he was sailing with the fleet than the fleet was sailing with him. When he wasn't doing that, when he was going to visit other European monarchs and travel around the world and so forth, sometimes I said the yacht would just go off on its own. Occasionally, there would be perhaps a small to medium-sized cruiser coming with it as basically a kind of glorified dispatch boat, dash secondary escort, particularly for long-distance journeys and rough seas. But more often than not, the yacht just went off and went about basically by itself because, well, it was essentially just considered that no one was going to mess with the yacht of a European monarch, and theoretically the ship could probably defend itself to a certain degree if something small like piracy was tried, and if something really big was tried, well, that's the ultimate, walk softly and carry a big stick. Because yes, maybe you could intercept the Hohenzollern and you could deal with it with your warships or whatever. You then got to deal with a high seas fleet. And unless you're the British, that's not something you want to be doing. If the gods had wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh, look, Mead asks, in Blazing Star, Setting Sun, Geoffrey R. Cox covers the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, in which the Royal Australian Air Force makes use of skip bombing for the first time against enemy shipping. In a skip bombing attack, the attacking aircraft makes an approach similar to a torpedo assault, but attacks with bombs that then skip across the surface as if they were oversized stones. Why did the RAAF aim for one direct hit and one near miss that was close enough to cause a mining effect, instead of just going for two direct hits or two misses with the associated mining effects? From what I've been able to determine, it seems that the RAAF was actually combining two slightly different tactics in one attack, because the twin-engined aircraft that were carrying out these attacks could drop more than one bomb. So they were like, okay, we'll do that. Now, of course, the immediate thing is if you drop more than one bomb, there's going to be a slight time difference in the releases, which means that if one is aimed correctly and will score a hit, the other one by inference won't, because it's released on a slightly different trajectory and timing. Now, what that means is that you're never going to get two direct hits unless you somehow simultaneously release two bombs at exactly the same time and they don't interfere with each other with all the skipping and the splashing. But anyway, what they were actually doing, again, at least by the kind of documentation I've been able to find, is, as I say, combining two related forms of attack. So one bomb would be a skip bomb. So you release that slightly further out and hopefully it bounces across. This would be the one that ideally would have a mining effect, because skip bombing's much more accurate than just trying to bomb from 5,000 feet or whatever, but you still can't guarantee exactly where the energy of that bomb is going to run out and when it's going to start to sink, other than approximately speaking. And then what they would do is, as soon as they release the skip bomb, they would do what's called a masthead attack. So that's dropping down really, really low and closing to what seems to be near suicidal range, and then release your bomb at basically kind of the last minute and pull up. And the idea of that is that essentially, obviously during the initial part of any bomb release, the bomb is traveling at roughly the same speed as the aircraft. Obviously it starts to immediately slow down because of air resistance, but in the initial part of its journey, it's traveling at almost the same speed as the aircraft. And the amount of drop is known because that's acceleration due to gravity. So essentially, if you can get close enough and you're at really low altitude, you drop the bomb, you're pretty much near guaranteed a hit, because it's going to fall 10 feet or so. And if you're at 15 feet, well, it's going to hit at 5 feet, which is going to be just above the waterline. And, well, then you've scored a direct hit. You just have to remember to pull up and get your timing on bomb release really, really good. And what the RAAF seems to have been doing is, as I say, basically going in and going, right, we're going to drop our skip bomb, and then we're going to go in for a masthead attack, and then hopefully we're going to get both. And if not, we're going to get one or the other. Because obviously each will have a hopefully crippling or sinking effect on the ship, but better to double your chances with two different forms of attack in a single run than rely on just going all in one or all in the other. Bald Man Dan's Tan Van Pan Van Plan Han Span Can Clan Grandstand Band asks, what was with Japan's love of linoleum for weather decks, despite the presumably higher fire risk, especially in the vicinity of their aircraft facilities? So there were a few theoretical advantages to using linoleum, or lino as you might know it these days. And we're talking about World War II linoleum, not the kind of stuff you'd find poking around your kitchen nowadays. That's something of a different material. But back then, linoleum was seen as somewhat lighter than wood. So assuming it offered the same kind of insulative and gripping properties that wood did, which is why you generally had wooden decks on steel ships, then, well, for the less weight, you could get the same thing, so all good. It was also relatively cheap. It was also quite waterproof. Now, obviously, you could apply it in large sheets, although very often it was applied in strips, a bit like planking anyway. And was actually much more maintenance friendly than wood. It didn't, kind of wear and chip and rot the way that wood did. And as a result, it needed less work and was fairly easy to lift up and replace as well. Now, the weird thing is, depending on which World War II documents you look at, linoleum is either very fireproof, perhaps even more fireproof than wood, or hilariously not fireproof and incredibly incendiary. Now, either way, a lot of ships would lose decking, whether it became in the form of linoleum or in the form of wood during World War II, just because whichever one it was still a fire hazard. But as for whether or not linoleum was a particularly worse fire hazard than wood, I suspect, and now this is my personal speculation, based on the materials that it's made of, that it was kind of a 6 of one, half dozen of another. Given the materials that most linoleum of the time was made of, in theory, short exposures, so things like bursting shells, maybe the occasional hot fragment or ember, short exposure to high temperatures, linoleum would in theory actually be less likely to char and smoke and catch fire than wood would. However, in the presence of continued heat, like say a fire burning nearby or a hot shell fragment that settles on the deck or something, linoleum would eventually catch, and then once it does catch and some of the constituent materials in it either start to burn or start to melt, then it will burn a heck of a lot more toxically, violently, and for longer periods than teak wood deck would, for instance. So I think that probably accounts for the disparity, where people are testing it against, if a shell hits here and there's a big fire flash and then that's it, linoleum probably is less likely to catch fire than teak, especially if it's wet, being on the upper decks. But if a shell, say, smashes into a nearby turret, disintegrates, and you get a couple of 20-kilo chunks of, boiling hot metal land on the linoleum, it won't catch fire immediately, but 30 seconds, 40 seconds later, as it starts to bubble and blister and burn, and then it does start to burn, you're going to have an absolute pig of a time putting it out compared to putting teak out. And then, of course, it's going to start spreading. Nathapron Hongsharon asks, the Des Moines barbette size seems to be less than a foot smaller than the Wyoming's twin 12-inch. Given 30 years of advancement, they should have been able to make a twin 12-inch small enough to fit on a Des Moines, but how would such a ship perform in the role that the Des Moines were actually intended for? Well, you certainly could get a ship of about the size of a Des Moines class with twin 12s on it. I mean, this is part of the design study scheme that would actually lead to the Alaska, so slightly predates the Des Moines. But in terms of tonnage and overall dimensions, this particular scheme, as you can see, Heavy Cruiser Scheme 3, it has 6 12-inch guns, 3 twin mounts, and basically you could squint and go, there, this is pretty much a Des Moines predecessor, except with 12-inch guns, because obviously the Alaskas end up being considerably larger, whereas this and a Des Moines are not too far removed from each other. So yes, you could do it. In terms of how would it perform in the role the Des Moines were intended for, actually I don't think they would do particularly well compared to a Des Moines class, because of course the Des Moines class were built to be the ultimate in heavy cruisers. So whereas some heavy cruisers would, or ultimate heavy cruiser designs would aim to overwhelm the enemy with just having more 8-inch guns, of course the Des Moines went with a rapid fire 8-inch. The problem with this idea, if you're going to use it in the Des Moines style role, is that you only have 6 guns, so not huge numbers of shells incoming, and being 12-inch guns and non-auto loading, they're not going to fire particularly rapidly. You're moving more towards capital ship levels in terms of rate of fire rather than heavy cruiser levels. So you've only got 6 shells coming in, and they're not coming in very often. So while you do have a range advantage, and of course pair that with mid to late war US Navy radar and fire control systems, you certainly could be picking off enemy cruisers at a reasonable old clip. The simple fact is, if you put a Des Moines with its 9 auto-loading 8-inch guns in there, it's going to do that a heck of a lot quicker. And obviously, because it has a much higher rate of fire, it can target multiple ships very quickly, and therefore it's in a much better place to deal with either lots of enemy cruisers or enemy cruisers as well as destroyers and so on, which this ship would be less well equipped to deal with. And to be honest, if you put this ship and a Des Moines up against each other, my money's probably on the Des Moines, because yeah, in theory each of these individual shells will hit a lot harder, but you're going to be hit by an awful lot more 8-inch shells. The Past is Another Country asks, assuming the US had decided it was a top priority to build a counter to the Deutschlands and the rumoured Japanese cruiser killers, could the US have realistically had 2 Alaskas ready at the start of 1942, with the other 4 perhaps coming into service during 1942? I assume the naval treaties would have been the biggest roadblock to an earlier start, and if not, with some hand-waving, how would having that same build schedule have affected the war? Would they perhaps get thrown into the meat grinder of Guadalcanal, be used as escorts in various carrier raids, or perhaps as convoy escorts in the Atlantic? I don't think they'd be used as escorts in the Atlantic, because for all their firepower, they do not have the protection to deal with what they particularly would be needed for, because, you know, if you're facing off against German cruisers or Hilfskreuzer, you don't need an Alaska. You can deal with that with regular cruiser forces. And if you're up against a Scharnhorst or a Bismarck, you know, yeah, the Alaskas have some nice firepower, but the German ships have considerably better protection. You absolutely do not want to be tanking 11-inch or 15-inch hits in an Alaska with its armor scheme. So, escorts for various carrier raids? Yeah, I think that's probably actually where you'd most likely see them. Now, of course, it would depend very much on precise fuel economy figures, but I can see somebody going, well, instead of having to commit 2 heavy cruisers to the cause, we could send 1 of these things in, and it'll actually offer far more protection in terms of absolute firepower, and that frees up 2 heavy cruiser hulls to go off and do other things. Now, of course, there's a limit to what you can do with that. You know, if you've got 4 heavy cruisers, you don't want to replace both of them with 2 Alaskas, because then you have gaps in your coverage. But you could certainly, you know, reduce the hull count of your escort forces while increasing the firepower, assuming that all the fuel economy elements work out for you. But as a result, I don't think they'd initially be in the Guadalcanal meat grinder, because they would be seen as very valuable escorts for the carriers, because they could potentially fight off Congos and or enemy heavy cruisers that are attacking the carriers. Plus, they've got a fair bit of anti-aircraft firepower to help defend the carriers. Plus, they've got that speed. I think they'd be held as very valuable carrier escorts. But obviously, the heavy cruisers that they free up from escorting the carriers could then be thrown into Guadalcanal. But then, as the Guadalcanal campaign drags on and heavy cruiser losses start to escalate, then yes, you probably would see the Alaskas pulled in the latter stages of the Guadalcanal campaign, which of course does open interesting potential of 1 or more Alaskas being present for the 2 big night actions, because, you know, the tactics that you'd use to deal with Hiei and Kirishima, if you're fighting with Alaskas rather than with 8-inch cruisers, yeah, those are going to be 2 very different things for that night action. And then, of course, if you have 1 or more Alaskas still available for the next day, do you even send in Admiral Lee at all? And if you do, well, he's going to have some fairly hefty friends coming with him. Now, as far as could they have been in service by 42? Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty strong case you could make. Because, I mean, if you take Alaska as an example, she effectively takes about 2.5 years to go from laid down to commission. And then, of course, you've got a bit of working up. So let's say 3 years from lay down to being fully worked up and ready for service. So if you want an Alaska or 2 in service by the start of 42, then that means, well, counting back, that's 41, 40, 39. So you have to start building them at the beginning of 1939. Beginning of 1939, the treaty system has actually collapsed. So if you were doing your design studies in 38, which is also a period during which the treaty system is pretty much null and void, yeah, you could conceivably actually, if there were priorities, have gotten a couple of Alaskas in service by the start of 42. Volunteer per order O'Sullivan asks, Commander Haynes' ideal monitor, as described in Ian Buxton's Big Gun Monitors, has a speed of 18 knots, guns with a range of 48,000 yards, and carries her own spotting aircraft. How exactly would one go about achieving an 18-knot monitor? Well, I can think of a couple of ways to do a 18-knot monitor. One potential way, if you're not quite as obsessed with absolute shallow draft as some monitor designs were, would simply be to take a pre-dreadnought and remove the aft turret. So that would, obviously you'd have to play around a lot with weights and stuff, and modify the forward turret to give you much greater elevation. So that gives you your big guns up forward. Being a pre-dreadnought is going to come at about 18 knots already. Take off the weight of the turret and probably a good chunk of the secondary and tertiary armaments. You've saved a bunch more weight there. Maybe even ditch a lot of the armor. Maybe just keep the central belt and ditch all the distributed stuff. So the reason why you're saving all this weight is because obviously you need to slap a bunch of bulges on for torpedo resistance and bring the draft up a little bit. And of course, saving the weight as well will help with that. Cut down the superstructure as well to a degree. And yeah, at that point, then you've got a monitor-ish vessel that can do 18 knots or so. And because you've cleared out the rear turret, you've probably got just enough space aft to put a aircraft or two and a launch rail and a little crane to bring it all back in. So that'd be a kind of a bodge job variant. The other way of doing it would be to look at some of the bigger Abercrombie and Erebus style monitors that were used towards the end of the First World War and then into the interwar period, and in the case of the Erebus is into the Second World War. This is Erebus, incidentally. Now, these ships could go around 12 knots, so you're already a decent portion of the way there. But when you look at this, you realise there's not really the space for aircraft at this point in time. And of course, with the big bulges underneath, it's not going to be particularly quick. But you can solve this. So how do you solve this, even though you've got the shallow draft? Well, simple. Make the thing longer. It's quite a simple solution, really. So take an Erebus or Abercrombie class monitor hull, add a bunch of additional length to it, and otherwise keep everything else the same. And within that additional length, you can fit a larger, more powerful engine or power plant setup. So that'll give you more power to go through the water faster. You've got a finer length to beam ratio, which is also going to help your speed. And as part of that extra lengthening, you then have, depending on how you arrange the machinery, either in a midships or an aft position, where you've got enough deck space that you can comfortably put an aircraft or two in the cranes and launch facilities, etc. And then you have the ideal monitor. Now, is this going to be a much larger ship? Yes, it is, because the Erebus and the Abercrombies, you're looking at around about 8,000 tons or so, give or take. So you're probably looking more at a 10, 12,000 ton vessel. But that would, in theory, give you your 18 knots, high elevation guns and own spotting aircraft. Red Ranger asks, if someone slipped a clause into the Washington Naval Treaty that stated any ship built before 1908 is exempt from any and all restrictions, which of the signatories would be least and most happy about it, and what could be done to utilise this potential loophole? I think outside of armoured cruisers and battleships and battle cruisers, basically nothing else is worth considering, because small cruisers, light armoured cruisers, protected cruisers, destroyers, subs, etc., anything that's 1908 or before in the 1920s context is so hopelessly obsolete, no one's going to want to keep those. So if we look at the 5 signatories of the Washington Naval Treaty, the Italians and the French pretty much don't care because, as we've established in various other questions in other dry docks, neither of them actually have the money to maintain even the ships they're allocated, let alone keep a bunch of even older ships around. So that leaves us with the big 3. In capital ship terms, I don't think either the British or the Americans are going to care all that much because, well, the British don't really want to keep any 12-inch capital ships around. They've got 13.5-inch and 15-inch ships coming out their ears. And even for the Americans, yeah, the pre-1908 capital ships, they're not really worth keeping around. Even the ones that the 12-inch ships they do want to keep around, or they have to keep around because they don't have enough 14-inch and 16-inch ships, they post-date 1908. And even the Japanese aren't really coming out of it that well, because the Kawachis post-date 1908, which means that the latest and greatest capital ships they could keep around would be the Satsumas, and I don't particularly want to keep them around anyway. But armoured cruisers might be another matter, because, of course, pretty much all the armoured cruisers predate 1908. And the reason why I say that might be a slightly different matter is because, well, compared to the new 10,000 ton and 8-inch limits on armoured cruisers, or on cruisers generally, the armoured cruisers, at least the last generations of them, are bigger, not necessarily faster, they're going to be somewhat slower in fact, but they're going to be bigger and more heavily armed, and in many cases much more heavily protected than what you can get on 10,000 tons as well. And that might provoke people to think, oh, maybe we should actually keep these things around. Because, for example, the Japanese, they've got the Ibukis and the Tsukubas, the kind of pre-dreadnought battle cruisers, if you like, armed with 2 sets of 12-inch guns. You can see one of them here. Now, is that a particularly useful armament set to be carrying around? Probably not. They might want to keep them around for various reasons. But if you look at the, particularly the Ibukis already have 4 twin 8-inch guns. Now, admittedly, that's in 2 twin mounts on either side. But you've got 7-inch armor. If you switch them over to turbines, you'll probably gain a few knots as well. And you could see the Japanese arguing, well, we started building them in 1905, so they're completely unlimited, and that potentially could give you a very powerful heavy cruiser design. Now, you'd be stripping out and essentially rebuilding them quite heavily, but in theory, I think you could take something like the 2 Ibukis and either rebuild them with 3 twin 12-inch, as well as an increase in speed, or possibly put rip out the 12-inch twins and take out the casement batteries and the 8-inch guns on either side, and move those 4 twin 8s to superfiring positions fore and aft. So that gives you 8 8-inch guns, which is a pretty decent armament by post-World War I, 1920s heavy cruiser capabilities, and plus you get the 7-inch armor, plus you've freed up a whole bunch of space down the side, and with turbine propulsion, some space amidships, so you might then be able to put in a fairly substantial secondary battery or aircraft handling facilities, etc., so make a really good flagship. The Americans kept some of their armor cruisers around for a while. The British might be somewhat tempted again, so you'd be looking at some fairly expensive, essentially total rebuilds, disguised as modernizations. But I think everybody's last generation armored cruisers, while they are obsolete as, they've been superseded by the battle cruisers, if they're now completely unrestricted, but you can kind of keep them around, I can see people going in for either complete or near complete rebuilds to turn them into kind of cruiser squadron flagships, where either they carry similar levels of firepower and maybe just about kept up with speed and have better protection, or maybe you get even more weapons on them. So maybe, like, say, with the Minotaurs, you might have a 9.2-inch battery of similar numbers to everybody else's 8-inch batteries. 6-inch armor is still fairly decent for a heavy cruiser of the 1920s, and then ramp the speed up as well, obviously getting rid of all of the side-mounted 7.5s and things. So I think that would be where there might be some gain, and I think of the nations, the Japanese will probably be the happiest about that, because apart from anything, they've probably got some of the better ship to work with, and it makes more of a difference to them. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, there were times in World War I and World War II where the sinking of merchant ships caused a real danger that Britain might be forced to bow out of the war. By mid-45, the tonnage reaching Japan was a mere fraction of that which would have starved Britain out of the war and probably could have been reduced to nothing. And Japan was also under intense air and sea bombardment. With this in mind, rather than an extremely costly invasion, why didn't the Allies simply starve Japan out of World War II? It was, in fact, one of the options on the cards. So part of the reason, at least in early to mid-1945, justifying a ground invasion was actually to get the war over more quickly, because with the Germans knocked out of the war and the European campaign coming to a close, there was a certain amount of public pressure to try and get the Pacific theatre sorted sooner rather than later, because even if you weren't going to invade Japan, then you would still need to have an extremely large fleet and air force mobilized to starve it out. And if you weren't going to invade Japan, one of the issues they actually did flag was that, well, if we do the blockade and starve out, technically it will work, but it might take quite a while. We will need a reasonably large army to do an occupation in one way, shape or form in the aftermath anyway. But if we then start demobilizing massive numbers of army troops, that could cause quite a lot of tension and friction with the Navy, because people were asking, well, my son's in the Navy, why isn't he being demobilized? Whereas, Bob down the street there who was in the Army, he gets to come home. And of course, even for the men in the Navy, there would be a concern of, well, if all these Army guards are getting demobilized, then by the time, 2-3 years down the line when I get demobilized, is there going to be a job for me? Because all the best jobs will have been taken years ago by the Army guys. So it was a concern, plus obviously the cost of the ongoing war weariness amongst the public, etc., people wanting it over now. This is why initially invasion and then, of course, the atomic bombs were looked at. But the idea of just starving Japan out was always a possibility that was kept on the cards. Essentially, the only real problem with it, as I say, was it takes longer to do, especially with a nation as fanatical as World War II Japan, who probably wouldn't have surrendered even if hundreds of thousands of their population were dying in the streets for the lack of food. Jesus Hinojosa asks, if the Free French had a safe harbour to go to, such as, say, a Free French-held Dakar, do you think their navy could have retreated and reorganised at another place? And if you could wave your hand, what would your dream Free French Navy base of operations be? I think how much of the Marine Nationale retreats to form the Free French Navy in the event of somewhere like Dakar going Free French and proclaiming itself the rallying point for all true Free French military personnel would depend very much on who is doing the rallying. There's lots of various alternate circumstances you could imagine. The most basic one of, one of the governors and maybe one of the admirals, particularly at somewhere like Dakar, going, actually, you know what, vive la France, and we're becoming the Free French. That could attract a certain number of people. I mean, the Vichy French government was terrified that exactly that happening would bring Richelieu over to the Free French. Of course, if you want to go a few weeks or months further back, you could also maybe have a situation where the French government that was in play and then was dissolved and replaced by the Vichy government, rather than it be a technically official handover of power, you could have it maybe where Renault's government is forced out through non-standard means, and the Vichy government takes over, at which point they could, again, retreat to or fly out to somewhere like Dakar and go, hang on a minute, look, we didn't want to give up government. We were forced out against our will. We're actually the legitimate government. Now, obviously, you can get into legal arguments over whether or not that's actually true, but if there was a degree of coercion in getting rid of them, that might be enough to persuade the elements of the Marine Nationale who kind of want to fight on, but maybe for whatever reason feel like they have to obey the Vichy government in the original timeline. They might go, well, actually, maybe there is an alternate government we can follow that's made up of pre-existing political leadership, and then obviously rally around that. Now, in terms of a dream Free French Navy base of operations, The problem is that the French don't really have that many large overseas bases of operations. Dakar and Mers el Kabir are probably some of the largest, and neither of them is particularly well placed for the way that World War II is actually going to shape up. And neither of them is particularly well supplied or self-sufficient either. Dakar, probably a little bit more self-sufficient generally, but definitely can't resupply its ships beyond what its warehouses have. Mers el Kabir is a bit better placed strategically, being obviously a lot closer to Gibraltar and the Mediterranean, but is also within a certain distance of Axis forces, and it relies, pre-war and during the early part of the war, it basically relies on France sending out military supplies to it. So while Mers el Kabir might be a useful operating base, realistically, if you had somewhere like Dakar as kind of the theoretical capital in exile of the Free French government, being that it is still technically French territory, then I think the actual base, while Dakar could be a kind of an official base of operations where people go for R&R and so forth, I think the day-to-day best base of operations for the Free French Navy, certainly for the majority of the Second World War, is probably actually going to be Gibraltar, because it puts them operating in or near waters they're already relatively familiar with, and it's already a preset fairly large naval base. The British have a good handle on how to keep that supplied, and it also puts them in a very strategically advantageous position of effectively taking over from or supplementing Force H, because you then have potentially multiple fast capital ships, Dunkirk's and Richelieu and so forth, being able to sortie either into the Atlantic if there's a big threat coming that way, or into the Mediterranean to fight the Regia Marina, which is, of course, the majority of what the Marine Nationale has planned around doing. So that, I think, probably would be the best place for them to operationally base out of. Explicitly Implicit asks, I've heard in a video about pirates of a particularly inventive bloke who had the idea of wrapping cotton around an arrow and then shoving it down his musket. He then fired said arrow into a fort they were besieging and detonated the ammunition storage. My question is, would this actually work in an asymmetric warfare scheme that involves wrapping flammable substances around ammunition, let's say bar shot, and firing it into the enemy's sails and rigging? Well, see, this is the funny thing. There's a bit of a crossover here between my naval history interests and my medieval history interests. Some of the very, very earliest guns, at least in Western Europe, actually fired big arrows instead of shot. Because, well, big arrows were actually easier to shape to the barrels. The barrels themselves weren't that wide compared to what they would later rapidly become. And, well, you got this thing that fires a projectile at high speed. Well, arrows are the projectiles they have at hand. So I was just like, well, make a big arrow. We'll fire that. That sounds good. So, yeah. Anyway, moving forward to the Age of Sail. I actually don't think the idea of wrapping some extra incendiaries around bar shot, star shot, etc., and trying to take out the enemies and sails and rigging with it would actually work all that well, to be perfectly honest. And the reason I say that is because sails, which are obviously the biggest target, they tend to be made of fairly thick, heavy canvas, and they are probably going to be somewhat damp, either from just generally being out at sea, or it was practiced to actually dampen sails to increase their draw in certain wind conditions. And having, when you fire a cannon, the shot is pretty hot coming out anyway. Having a little bit of extra incendiary material around it, which hopefully would catch fire, it's just not going to be enough, really. If the star shot or bar shot passing through the sail didn't impart enough heat to set the thing on fire, then a little bit of cotton or other incendiary wrapped around it probably isn't going to do much different either. And, rigging is a very difficult target to hit. And while, yes, things like the tar and everything long term could burn quite nicely, in the short term, they actually would resist, a relatively low temperature, uncontained fire relatively easily. Now, there are ways you could potentially do this. So, for example, you could go with something like not a chain shot in the traditional sense of two weighted metal halves with a chain in the middle, but something that would be a kind of very loose shot. So not wire, because wire is expensive, but lots of little bits, almost like firing a bunch of caltrops and small link chain, that kind of stuff, a kind of shotgun blast, the cannon equivalent of bird shot, essentially. Something that could stick into sails rather than just punch massive holes through them, or would rip into sails and maybe catch partly. So maybe some kind of a very heavily wrapped small link chain with lots of hooks on it or something. That, with some kind of long burning incendiary, might be able to set fire to the sails and so forth. But it would be a very, very limited use thing, because there'd be absolutely no chance that kind of ammunition is going to go through the side of the hull of an enemy ship. It could have some fairly deleterious effects on people on the upper decks, but you are very heavily restricting yourself in what you can actually fire it at. Now, if you're looking for a very specific outcome, like, say, you're outnumbered, and the only way for you to get away is to do some very serious damage very quickly to the enemy's sails, and you don't really intend on trying to fight them hull to hull, or the enemy is, let's say, a fleet at anchor, and you want to destroy them all as quickly as possible, and obviously bringing down a bunch of burning sails on top of them is a good way of doing that, then there might be some niche use for it. But as a general ammunition type, it's probably not going to be all that useful. I mean, apart from anything else, you set fire to an enemy ship and it catches fire and burns to the waterline or blows up. That's a lot of prize money that just disappeared. Vinve asks, watching your 5-minute guide on icebreakers got me thinking about the situation with the Ganguts in Helsinki. Realistically speaking, if a group of enterprising sailors happened to steal a dreadnought in 1918, let's face it, there's probably going to be the Finns, and they gift it to the nation of their choice, what do you think would have been the smallest country and navy that was able to actually maintain and meaningfully operate such a battleship during the interwar years? In all honesty, it's probably not going to be Finland, even if their coastal artillery uses the same 12-inch guns. But maybe Sweden, Poland, or the Netherlands? Well, assuming all politics aside and that the Russians don't try and get the Gangut back from the Finns, and the Finns just, auction it off to the highest bidder, it is a bit of an interesting one, because obviously operating a dreadnought as opposed to a pre-dreadnought or coast defense ship does take a bit more finances, but you theoretically could replace multiple ships with one. The big three South American countries, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile at the time, obviously they all have their own dreadnoughts, so they've already established that. I think if the other South American countries probably can't. Canada's quite a big country. Australia's already operated a capital ship. I think if you're looking at independent countries that could operate a Gangut class dreadnought, now admittedly most of these countries would have to decommission their existing ship, but in existing capital ships, that is. But I think you could make an argument for Spain. Certainly, Spain obviously operates 3 and gradually diminishing dinky little 12-inch armed battleships. So theoretically, they could send those off and say, hey, we've got just one nice big flagship battleship. Greece, I think, would potentially be another option. They were operating a pair of small ex-US, that is, pre-dreadnoughts. So they could trade those in, and to the breakers in exchange, put that money and resource into running one Gangut. Sweden, definitely, potentially. Of course, it would mean sadly having to get rid of at least one of the Sverriers, or maybe they keep the Sverriers and ditch a whole bunch of other coastal defense stuff. Maybe some older coast defense ships and stuff. But, I mean, given the Ganguts are designed to operate in the Baltic, I'm certain the Swedes could operate one. Poland, I don't think Poland in 1918, 1919, 1920 would be able to do so. They just don't have the infrastructure and experience to do so. The Dutch almost certainly could. I mean, given the Dutch are sort of eternally frustrated in their attempts to get a battlecruiser or a battleship out of somebody by various world wars, yeah, they could, probably, again, like the Swedes, maybe trade in some of their smaller coastal defense ships in exchange for running just this one big ship, which they were kind of planning on running a few big ships anyway. So I think those would be the contenders: Spain, Greece, Sweden, or the Netherlands. I think anything much smaller than that, and they're probably just not going to be able to. Kirstendarken asks, while listening to Drydock 370, I was happy to discover I'm not the only one who loves to take photographs of various notices posted in places I visit. I was wondering if you could share some of the more interesting notices that you photographed on your trips but didn't make it into their related videos. And were there any particular ones that made you think, what insane thing did somebody do to make that necessary? Well, many, many years ago in the early 2000s, I visited Russia with my university course to look at various bits and pieces of engineering, and I came across this wonderful sign out in St. Petersburg, which appears to forbid basically everything. So yeah, make up your own interpretation of what each of these little notices means yourself. Of course, there's the highly amusing sign at U505 in Chicago, where the number of people on board the U505 is limited by, I'm not sure whether it's federal or state law, but one or the other. It's actually limited to significantly less than the number of people who actually crewed the submarine in World War II for safety reasons. There's another one which I managed to grab a picture of while I was in Japan recently, where the notice says, it essentially says no disruptive behavior, but the little, picture in the red circle with a dash through it appears to be a full-on martial arts fight, which is apparently classified as disruptive behavior in Japan. There's one on USS New Jersey, and I'm pretty sure it's on all the other US Iowa class as well, near the harpoon launchers, which I especially like because the procedure in the event of a hydrazine leak is to first stand there, look around, while being drenched presumably in hydrazine, and report to the nearest officer for instructions. I have a feeling I might take at least a little bit of evasive action if there was hydrazine cascading out of a missile on top of me, but there you go. I've seen at least one notice, I can't remember which ship it was on, but I've seen at least one notice printed out, not printed out on a modern A4 thing, but it's been printed or typed out at some point during the ship's operational career, which was stuck up near the ship's reduction gearing, and it says, do not place objects, brackets, including hands, close brackets, in the reduction gearing, which presumably means at some point there was a sign that didn't have those brackets on there and somebody did feed their hands into the reduction gearing. And similarly, there are signs on the hoists for the charges in, I'm pretty sure it's various Iowa class magazines that specifically say do not ride. So presumably somebody at some point rode the charge hoist all the way up to the turret and then got dumped out on a rack, and presumably avoided being loaded into the gun by the fact that the people in the gun turret were somewhat observant and noticed they didn't look like 610-pound lumps of gunpowder. Andre de Coult asks, you often say that if you're doing X to solve Y, you've got much bigger problems than X would ever solve. Could you please give some examples in naval terms of, so I'll answer these as we go through the question. 1. Doing X actually does solve Y, despite having much bigger problems, and maybe even mitigates those big problems somewhat, if not entirely. Depending on how you interpret his voyage, Drake's Round the World voyage may be an example of this. Now, historians are divided as to whether Drake actually fully intended to sail around the world from the start and was just basically putting in a series of plausible cover stories for his men to ensure they followed him long enough that they then were in a situation where they didn't have a choice anymore. Whereas other interpretations suggest that Drake's main objective was to get to the western side of South America because the Spanish wouldn't be guarding against raiders in the Pacific, loot a bunch of stuff, and then go home back the way he came. Now, under the latter interpretation, if you believe that, Drake then faces a problem of, yes, he's managed to loot a absolutely tremendous amount of valuables from the Spanish. However, now the Spanish are very much aware that there is an English ship in the Pacific on the western coast of South America, And they are very much prepared for him to come back the way he did, round the south tip of South America and back up the east coast of that continent. And then Drake's solution is to say, oh, well, okay, the one thing they won't expect us to do is sail all the way across the Pacific. So in the broader context of the initial question, if you're sailing across the entirety of the Pacific, something that extremely few people have ever lived through doing before, to solve the problem of the Spanish hunting you down, well, yeah, you now have much bigger problems than the Spanish hunting you down. However, in this case, it did actually work. Again, if you accept that that's why he made the decision to cross the Pacific in the first place, he did evade Spanish capture, and he actually mitigated the larger problem of Spanish dominance of a lot of both South American and, to a certain extent, although it was perhaps a bit more Portuguese on that side, Southeast Asian trade, by demonstrating that other ships could and did survive those journeys. Example 2 would be not doing X, even though you have much bigger problems, would result in you having even larger problems still. Well, if you want to take a particularly harsh view of the condition of the 50 destroyers that Britain traded for bases in World War II, you could then make the argument that, well, if you've got major problems with U-boats, sticking a bunch of worn-out, rusted, pretty clapped-out old destroyers that aren't particularly agile, don't have the best range, and certainly are not in any way, shape or form the best ASW hunters that you traded a bunch of valuable bases for. And bear in mind, the US Navy will give you the oldest and worst of all the ones they have in reserve. Yeah, you have a lot bigger problems than you got a bunch of rusted out destroyers of marginal value. Of course, as I said, that is being very harsh about the situation. But if you did want to be that harsh, well, even if you are that harsh, not putting those destroyers, as suboptimal as they might be as convoy escorts, not putting them on convoys gives you even bigger problems, because, yeah, you might lose some to subs, and yeah, they're nowhere near the best sub hunters available, but they're there. And that counts for something. That does save you some ships. The third element is how often those discussing doing X, the whatever madcap idea it was, showed in their historical records that they were aware that X wouldn't solve their bigger problems. I think, to be honest, that particular one actually has so many examples, it's difficult to pick any individual one. There are plenty of cases, especially when people felt that their back was up against the wall, of discussions going, look, this is probably not going to have a huge effect. It's definitely not going to solve the overall issue, but it is at least going to show that we're doing something, and that might have a morale effect, and it might even, buy us a few days or weeks to actually come up with a solution that does work, and therefore we need to do this thing, even though in and of itself it's not actually going to solve the problem. That actually crops up a lot. A fourth, in your opinion, the most significant thing they went ahead with, knowing that they had bigger problems that thing wasn't going to solve. I'd say this is possibly a marginal example because it didn't actually quite occur, but they were absolutely prepared and willing to do it, so I'm kind of think it counts. And that would be the theoretical last ride of the Regia Marina, because of course you get Operation Tengo and the last ride of Yamato and so forth, but when you look at what the Regia Marina was preparing to do to try and disrupt the Allied landings in Italy by sailing out basically anything and everything that they still had operational and could give at least enough fuel to get to the landing zones with, that is actually a far larger and far more significant operation, would have actually been the only incident that would have probably resulted in a full-on, straight-up fleet engagement between battleships in the classic style. Now, the thing was, when the Italians drafted up that plan, they knew full well that at best they could hope to disrupt the landings. They knew they weren't going to defeat the landings or the Allied effort. Even if they caused absolute, pipe dream levels of damage to the Allied landing efforts and the warships that were escorting it, they knew the Allies had plenty more where that came from and could just start up again fairly quickly. But the point of it was more to just show that they were doing the absolute utmost to defend the homeland more than anything else. Now, as I say, due to the armistice coming in, they didn't actually pull off that operation, but if the negotiations had been delayed a week or two, they would have certainly given it a good shot. And then finally, in your opinion, what's the most hilarious thing drafted up when you look at it as a paper idea that actually turned out to be quite good in practice? Now, for this, I think, much like a few other things, I kind of have a rotating podium for these. But I think at the moment, the two that immediately come to mind would be the catapult-armed merchantman, because on paper, the idea of, hey, we're going to find a pilot mad enough to sit in an old airframe, lifetime expired aircraft, be catapulted-rocketed off of the deck of a merchant ship with no hope of landing. He's then going to have to fly this rickety crate after a German patrol aircraft, try his best to shoot it down, and then with whatever limited fuel he has remaining, he's going to have to voluntarily ditch himself in the freezing waters of the Atlantic and hope that a nearby ship notices him and picks him up before he freezes to death. That is an absolutely ridiculously insane concept. But as it turns out, the catapult-armed merchantman was, to a degree, actually somewhat successful in, shooting down a handful of German patrol aircraft and scaring off an awful lot more of them, which was all to the good, especially when you consider the, cost of a clapped-out old airframe versus even one or two merchant ships that might be saved by disrupting the Kriegsmarine's network between its submarines and its patrol and the patrol aircraft. Of course, you try and save as many pilots as you possibly can. The other one is the Lagonda flamethrower. Now, you may have seen me discuss that in another Drydock a while ago, but that was basically the idea of having a vertically mounted flamethrower on a ship, which would, in theory, deter or burn German aircraft that were coming in for low-level attacks. Now, yeah, on paper, the idea of let's put a big flamethrower on a ship and project a jet of burning hydrocarbons directly above us, this can't possibly go wrong, is absolutely mad. And indeed, in and of itself, as a weapon for shooting down aircraft, it was hopelessly terrible. But between it and a few other almost equally mad-sounding improvised anti-aircraft solutions, it weirdly enough did seem to have an effect on the Luftwaffe. Not that the Luftwaffe lost any aircraft to it, but it seems that having seen these various madcap ideas, the Luftwaffe, presumably in a hope of not catching the crazies from the merchant ships, or something to that effect, decided that they were going to order their aircraft to fly a little bit higher when bombing merchant ships. Because, yeah, if you're attacking a ship whose crew are mad enough to install a giant flamethrower on the vessel, who knows what else they might have down there. And as a result, simply by moving the bomb drop altitude somewhat higher, the attacks became less precise, and therefore merchant ships were bizarrely saved, despite the fact the flamethrower itself didn't actually, as far as I'm aware, actually destroy any German aircraft. Sage of Irrelevance asks, throughout the time period the channel focuses on, countries that lacked significant shipbuilding capabilities would often purchase warships from foreign countries. As far as you know, when was the first time this occurred? Did any special diplomatic agreements have to be reached beforehand, or did a foreign dignitary just walk up to a shipyard one day and place an order? Buying warships from overseas is something that's been going on almost as long as warships have been in existence. So trying to pinpoint the first time it occurred in any specific circumstances is basically a fool's errand, because there's always going to be a predecessor. However, when it comes to how you do that, do you need special diplomatic agreements and so forth? Compared to what happens these days, it was actually a much simpler process. Because, of course, these days there's all sorts of diplomacy involved, potential transfer of classified information and all this kind of stuff. Whereas back in the day, you kind of had essentially three ways of getting a warship from one country to another if you wanted to buy one. So at the highest level, you could go and see, okay, there is a warship, it's already in service with the other nation, I want it, I'm going to have to go and speak to that nation's rulers, and we're going to have to work out a deal. Now, of course, the advantage was, at that point, because it is the people in charge of the nation that you're talking to, they, by inference, can also, grant themselves the permission to export said warship. So, for example, when Henry VIII wants to build up the Royal Navy, he turns around to a bunch of the Hanseatic League states, like Lubeck and Hamburg, and is like, I see you have a fine ship there. I would dearly like it to be in my fleet. How much gold do I have to give you? And they name a figure, there's some negotiation, and then money is exchanged, and hey, there's a brand new warship in the Royal Navy. The next level down is independent contracting. So you approach a shipyard and you say, hey, I would like you to build a frigate for me. And hence why we've got these pictures of some Italian warships from the 1850s, 1860s being built, of all places, in the United States. And in those cases, not just obviously Italy buying from the US, but it could be Prussia buying from England or Britain, or the Ottomans buying from France or something like that, whatever. In those cases, your approach would initially be to a company. So you'd go up to the company representatives, or they would come to you and you'd say, okay, I would like you to build a warship. This is what I want. Maybe they make some suggestions. You work out the design and you say, okay, I want you to build that ship. Great, fine, fantastic. Business transaction. The only point during most of the period that the channel covers up until the early 20th century, when the government would get involved, would be essentially just to rubber stamp it, unless the person trying to buy the warship is an active enemy of the nation that the private company belongs to. The government is basically just going to step back and say, well, that's your business. Because, well, a 32-pounder cannon is a 32-pounder cannon for the age of sail, let's say. Or even in the ironclad period, with newer and better guns are coming out every 5 minutes, the idea of controlling arms exports, it's like, well, why does anyone care if we sell them 3 dozen 32-pounders or a 60-ton gun? Because in the first case, well, we've got hundreds and hundreds of others and we can build still more. And in the latter case, well, I'm sure an 80 or 100-ton gun will be along in, the next 5 minutes. So that doesn't make much odds either. So at that point, as far as the government is concerned, is this likely to be actively used against us in the short term? If not, fine, whatever. We don't really care. Obviously, as technological advancement progresses towards the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, and you do start to get an actual divergence, as in, these guns might actually give this nation a qualitative advantage over a whole bunch of others, that's when you start to see more and more regulation over what governments will and won't allow various nations, various companies to export to other countries. And then the final option is to be a little bit sneaky about it, which is what, for example, the Confederacy ended up doing when it became clear that various governments weren't going to necessarily sell them straight up warships, and that is to commission a private company to make a ship that is ostensibly of a civilian nature. And up until the latter part of the 19th century, the fact that it has gun ports and the provision to carry weapons and so forth doesn't actually make too many odds, because, hey, East Indiamen carry quite a lot of guns. So the fact that you're making a large ship that could carry lots of guns doesn't make it a warship. It just means it can carry some self-defensive armament. The fact that once that ship is out at sea and in international waters, you actually equip it with an actual warship's armament instead of a bunch of 6-pounders or whatever, well, at that point, it's in international waters, it's out of the control of the government that originally allowed the civilian sale of a ship. Silderan Machine Works asks, you've often mentioned the magical French forced circulation boilers. I'd like to know more about them. Were they more efficient than other boilers? Did they just increase the power density? And why are they uniquely French? Did other countries fail to duplicate the technology, or did they not see it as worth the effort to do so? So I discussed this recently in another Drydock, but just to sort of clarify for those who may have missed it, the power plants, as you find in things like the Richelieu class, have this rather unique boiler for World War II, in that when you are looking at a normal boiler, the normal boiler heats up the water, and then obviously as the water gets hotter, it wants to go to steam, and therefore it starts to become less dense. And the change in temperature and density is what drives the circulation of the water through the boiler tubes. Now, that's great, except it has a few limitations. Firstly, of course, there's a fixed amount of energy once the water starts moving, it's got a certain temperature. As it moves, it's going to lose energy to friction. It's going to lose energy if it has to change direction. And as it moves away from the heat source, the furnace is also going to cool down. So what that means is that to get the circulation going, A, there's a limited speed to which it can get going, given a certain amount of temperature input, and B, the circulation tubes have to be shaped in such a way as to, reduce friction losses, not have particularly tight curves and turns, because that can lead to, A, backing up and water hammer effects, but also very significant losses of energy. And so how you lay out those tubes is governed by these factors, and that means that the boilers have to be of a certain size. You can't go below that size because you can't shape the pipes and tubes for the water as you would necessarily like to get the most compact form. Whereas with the forced circulation boilers, by introducing a pump into the system, you're introducing a constant external supply of pressure and therefore energy to push the water around, so you can achieve faster circulation speeds, and you can now have very tight turns, very compact pipe layouts and so forth, because the extra energy that's required to overcome that is being provided by said pump. The disadvantage, of course, being that if the pump, for whatever reason, stops working, you can have some very serious problems. But what it means overall is that for a given for a boiler that generates a given amount of energy, by using forced circulation, you can fit that boiler in a much smaller volume. Therefore, you can either have the same power output in a much smaller volume in the ship, thus your machinery space is smaller, potentially weighs less, and thus you've saved space and weight to use in other things. Or if you have machinery space that is approximately the same size as it would be otherwise, you have a much more powerful machinery set, and therefore you can go faster, or somewhere on the sliding scale in between those two extremes. Now, the idea of forced circulation boilers wasn't unknown elsewhere, but the French were the first to implement it on a large warship scale. Now, there was considerable discussion towards the end of the war as to both the forced circulation of the water and the first forced circulation of the air, as well as obviously things like increasing steam pressure and so forth. However, while some of those ideas were taken forward with various conceptual steam power plants in the immediate post-war environment, you of course also have the rise of more efficient diesel engines and gas turbines in the early to mid-Cold War period. So while I think if steam power plants had continued to be the power plant of choice for warships throughout the mid to late 20th century, you certainly would have seen both this and derivatives of it being taken up on a much larger scale. The fact is that essentially the idea started to percolate across the world around about the same time as various other alternatives to the oil-fired steam turbine power plant were becoming viable. 54 asks, the films Greyhound and Hunt for Red October both feature a sequence in which the titular vessel, in both cases powered by geared turbines, reverses her starboard propeller in an effort to evade an incoming torpedo. I believe you've addressed this issue before, but my question is not just whether it would work, but whether you have ever come across an example of this actually happening. I know power to each propeller was often modulated for tight manoeuvres in harbour or to compensate for a steering casualty, but has anyone ever reversed one of their engines in extremis in an attempt to evade a torpedo, bomb, or iceberg? As far as I'm aware, in what you might term a combat situation, I can't think of anyone who's actually done that, because if you've got an incoming torpedo or, worse still, a bomb in a World War II context, just the amount of time it would take for anything other than a turboelectric drive to actually fully engage a reverse on a propeller to have an actual effect, it would take too long, and the effect would be relatively marginal, potentially even actually negative, because if you shut down a propeller on one side, then you're significantly reducing the pressure that is being exerted on the rudder. So, for example, if you're trying to reverse the starboard propeller, that suggests you want to turn to starboard, which would mean also your rudder would be over hard to starboard. But if your starboard propeller has stopped generating thrust, then there's less pressure on the rudder, so the rudder isn't actually going to have as much effect. So you've actually potentially made yourself turn less well. Now, if you do have some kind of turbo electric drive or some other way where you can fairly rapidly switch the power going into your propeller, that might change things somewhat, but you've still got to slow the thing down from presumably going full pelt forward to a point where you can safely put it into full reverse. So, yeah, the amount of time that you would need to do that on a large ship, I think, is just prohibitive. And as a result, I don't think I'm aware of anyone who's actually tried. There have been a few cases that I can recall where they've slowed down the revolutions on one side or the other because then you're still generating some pressure on the rudder, but you're also generating differential thrust, which might give you a little bit of an assist. And of course, there are cases like, for example, the Marblehead, which in the absence of a working rudder did manage to navigate through some fairly difficult situations by varying the speed and direction of her propellers. But that was in a navigational situation, albeit a hazardous one, rather than an active combat situation. So essentially, I think the only time you're going to see one propeller put into full reverse, the other put into full ahead in a combat situation for a large warship, as opposed to a small vessel where it might be a bit easier, is going to be if the rudder, for whatever reason, is completely ineffective already. Which, again, it kind of loops back to you've got much bigger problems at this point. And you could end up with some kind of hybrid situation where you're trying to steer because your rudder is not effective by using variations on your propellers, but that's more trying to maintain some form of control rather than necessarily strictly evading. So, for example, Bismarck in her final battle, probably wasn't putting one of her propellers in reverse, but certainly was using differential power to try and maneuver. But that was more about maneuvering. She wasn't dodging incoming shell fire or torpedoes by doing so. Coneled asks, assuming that for whatever reason the redwood and sequoia forests of California had just happened to be growing on the east coast, maybe in the Carolinas, instead of the west coast, so European explorers discover them in the 16th century, do you think that regular access to 50-plus metre straight timber would have affected ship construction procedures and design? And how would European powers have managed the forests, if at all? And would they have been prompted to build a robust shipbuilding industry in the surrounding colonies? And further, assuming some shipwright tried to build a frigate or larger vessel out of a single tree, how big would that tree have to be? General Sherman, the largest tree in the world, weighs about 4 million pounds and is 275 feet tall. Now, off the top of my head, I will admit I don't know exactly what the properties of sequoia or redwood are relative to something like oak, because I'm not a timber specialist. But if we assume, for the sake of argument, that broadly speaking, the timber properties of a giant redwood tree are similar to the kinds of woods that people would make sailing warships out of in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, then having regular access to really long straight timber might well have affected ship construction procedures for a number of reasons. Because, a really big tree, like you say the General Sherman, that is a tree that is more than long enough to just have one continuous piece keel timber. Now, you could get that kind of thing elsewhere, but it was much more difficult, especially as ships got larger and larger. Now, and of course, the risers at the bow and stern would have to be cut from separate bits of timber, but you would have access to, theoretically, very easy, very long, very sturdy single-piece keels, which would be quite handy. And similarly, because, as you can see with the size of these trees, you would also, with a little bit of shaping, be able to have long single-piece timber, essentially bracing beams, running fore to aft along the length of the ship. So, and in smaller pieces, obviously, side to side as well. So you would be able to build your classic age of sail ship, keel, framing, bracing timbers, etc., with far fewer individual timbers, which would actually make the whole thing a lot stronger. There would be more work, obviously, going into shaping those individual timbers, but the end result, with less interior joins, less, therefore, slipping and so forth, would have an overall benefit. The only downside, of course, is for warships, as and when one of those things gets damaged and you have to cut a section out and replace it, now you're introducing a weakness where previously there wasn't one, whereas if you're building a ship out of multiple shorter pieces of timber, especially for the framing and bracing and decking and so forth, then if any one bit gets smashed, removing it and replacing it doesn't actually manifestly change much in terms of the ship's overall strength, assuming that you replace it with a similar kind of timber. But it could, for example, allow for some slightly larger than average merchant ships, and for areas that are perhaps less likely to get shot through with cannon shot, like the keel, it certainly would be of a quite substantial benefit. Now, would the European powers have managed the forests, if at all? It depends how big they are, because even with their home forests, various European powers did seem to have a repeated distressing tendency to go, hey, look, there's this forest as far as the eye can see. It surely must therefore be functionally infinite. And then 50 years later, it turns out it wasn't functionally infinite. Now we're out of timber. So, yeah, that could be a problem, especially given the amount of time that you need to get these really, really big trees going. But then, at the same time, when they did run out of timber, they were like, oh, yeah, maybe we need to manage the forests. So forest management was kind of a pendulum in various European nations for the most part during the Classic Age of Sail. So if you're lucky, the European powers might start setting up their shipyards in and around those timber forests in a period when one or more of them is actually on a little bit of a forestry and forest management bent, and therefore might actually take a bit more care about them. On the other hand, you might end up with the opposite, and they just cut down as much timber as they possibly can and build as many ships as they possibly can without any regard for what's actually happening. So, bit of a coin toss on that one. And assuming a shipwright tries to build a frigate or larger out of a single tree, unfortunately that's not going to work, because even with a really big tree, like the one you can see in this picture, the trees tend to have a very, very long length to beam ratio if you're laying them out. So you could make the world's biggest log canoe, but even brigs, sloops and schooners, that kind of stuff, had a beam of around 30 feet or just over, and even the General Sherman has a width of about 25 feet, and obviously that's full width, so once you've taken off the bark and shaped it, it's going to be maybe a bit less than that. So for even a Classic Age of Sail brig, you're going to need a tree that's probably 30 to 40% larger in all dimensions than the General Sherman, which that's going to be a heck of a tree. Now, obviously, as you wind further back in time, ships do get smaller to a certain degree. So if you go back to, say, the Tudor period, the original dimensions of the Golden Hind, Drake's ship, are actually, beam-wise at least, are less than the General Sherman. So a General Sherman-sized tree, in theory, could be used to make a substantial or the substantial portion of the hull of something like the Golden Hind. You'd still have to independently probably do the gunwales and the forecastle and stern castle, but the actual hull itself you will probably just about make out of a really, really, really big Sequoia. It'd be a really weird carving job, but yeah, it could be done. And of course, the Golden Hind is much shorter than the General Sherman is tall, so with that country you can make several ships. Ivan asks, which ship from the French Charles Martel so-called class of pre-dreadnoughts was the least atrocious? I have little doubt that Messena was the worst one, but what was the best? Maybe the one whose name begins with J that I can never pronounce properly. Well, I have gone over my own sort of scattershot comparison of the various features of the loose Charles Martel class in a previous Drydock question, but if you look at the way the Marine Nationale rated things, they seemed to think that of all of them, the Bouvet was the least bad. And that's simply because by 1914, outbreak of the First World War, every other one of the Charles Martels had been decommissioned to one extent or another. And I suppose you could maybe make inferences as to which ones the French Navy really hated by which ones they'd gone, we're getting rid of you, and which ones they go, we'll keep you around as a reserve for the minute. by 1914, but Bouvet was the only one of them which was actually still in active service. Now, of course, that didn't end well for her over at the Dardanelles, but in 1914 she was seen as the most valuable of them, which is not perhaps that surprising considering she's the last of the group to be constructed and therefore has the opportunity to draw on some of the lessons from the first couple of ships to be have their keel laid and so forth. So yeah, and overall, when you look at her, she's among the faster of them. Admittedly, the speed regimen spread isn't that great, but she is at the top end of that. She also has a somewhat longer range than most. Obviously, the main armament is all the same on all of them, 305mm and 274mm. There's a whole discussion about, obviously, the secondary, tertiary, etc., armament of the various ships. But she does have, unlike some of the ships, she doesn't use compound armor. She does actually use modern steel armor, or at least modern for the time. And so for the period, she's relatively well protected as well. It also kind of shows in her displacement, because she displaces a few hundred tons more than pretty much all the rest of those vessels. So yeah, Bouvet essentially is the winner, but that's also not necessarily so surprising because, as I said, of her being the last one and being able to draw on lessons from the others. It's a much more fraught question if you exclude Bouvet and just look at the remaining ships of what the French termed the fleet of experiments. August asks, at what point during the time period the Channel covers was the inter-service rivalry between the US Armed Forces at their most significant? And what was the single most impactful event or in this rivalry? Personally, I'd have to say right at the very end of the time period the Channel covers, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Because, let's face it, the US Army, such as it was essentially a border patrol force and not really a huge amount else for the vast majority of US history during the time period the Channel covers. Obviously, it sees a massive expansion in the US Civil War for obvious reasons, but between the American War for Independence and the US Civil War, apart from the 1812 shenanigans, the US Army, compared to, pretty much every other major army, is a really, really tiny institution, and it goes back to being a relatively small institution in the aftermath of the US Civil War, and only really gets picked up again in the 1910s as the US prepares to enter World War I. Because if you look at the on-paper strength of the US Army in 1914, it's, well, for anyone who's used to the US Army at the size and shape that it is nowadays, it would make for incredibly depressing reading. The British, with the BEF, weren't, exactly heavyweights on the European stage when you consider the size of armies like those of France and Germany. But even just the British Expeditionary Force sent to France in 1914 outnumbered and significantly outgunned the entirety of the American Army and National Guard put together by a factor of about 2.5 to 3 times. That gives you some idea of the sheer mobilization that was done between 1914 and 1917, but there you go. And as such, the US Army wasn't really in a position to argue all that much with the US Navy. And the US Navy had various periods during that time period where it was having to argue for and justify its own existence as well. But when you fast forward to 1945 to 1950, the last bit of time that the Channel covers, then you have some really interesting issues because, of course, both services and latterly the US Air Force, which is beginning to, in that time period, become its own independent thing, as opposed to being the US Army Air Corps and then the US Army Air Forces. You've got massive military, which is having to be forcibly downsized because you're not in a world war anymore. Budgets being cut left, right, and centre. But simultaneously, you've got all these new technological advances coming out of World War II, missiles, jets, etc., etc., all of which are expensive, all of which are making new military procurement considerably more expensive than old military procurement. And so there's a huge fight over that resourcing and funding. And then you have the shadow of the atomic bomb hanging over everything, because it's very clear that the atomic bomb is going to be at least a major element, if not the major element, of any future war. And the service that gets to control that is obviously the one that's going to get a lot more funding. And so you have this massive, intense rivalry going on as who is going to deliver said bomb. Of course, the US Army Air Force, later to be the US Air Force, can make the claim correctly that they are the ones who have delivered the atomic bombs, and they have the strategic bombers to do so. Whereas the US Navy can point out that, well, hey, you weren't ever going to drop an atomic bomb on the Japanese without us securing you the necessary landing fields. And also, we can build a really big carrier and put a strategic bomber on that, and then we don't need to secure landing fields or worry about fixed place, vulnerable installations. We can just sail around with a big floating airfield wherever we like and send nukes off. And, well, if we can get closer to the enemy than this is where the island happens to be, then we can do it with a strategic bomber that can focus perhaps on speed to get in and out very quickly, as opposed to just having to have a really big high-altitude, long-range thing. And on the arguments went. And that, of course, leads to eventually the revolt of the admirals, the cancellation of the USS United States, and this whole dramatic fallout right at the very end of the period the channel covers. Lord Nelson asks, what kind of ships were used by Japanese pirates raiding the Chinese coast in the years of the Qing period? Is it Qing? Qing? I don't know. Qing anyway. The Japanese pirates seem to have used a variety of ships. Now, of course, this is not necessarily my area of speciality, Japanese pirate raiders of the 15th, 16th century. But from what I've been able to determine, they used a wide variety of ships. So they had some very small ships for close-in coastal and river work. They had a variety of Chinese junks that they basically stolen because, hey, why not? But they also seem to have, because they obviously needed to get from Japan to China, a certain number of relatively large ocean-going ships. And, of course, stylized illustrations don't necessarily help with precise details, but you can kind of see some of the design elements in this kind of artwork. And they appear to be kind of evolutions on the ships that you would more typically see around Japanese coastal waters. So much like the Chinese ships, for that matter, they have this very curved hull profile with a very, very high stern, which is sometimes said to have had a horseshoe shape. And then the bow, rather than being what we might consider to be an ocean-going bow in the European sense of coming to a point, in some ways looked almost a little bit like what we would imagine a landing craft to be. So not completely slab-sided, but basically the two sides of the hull coming up to a certain point, but then you had a, relatively speaking, flat profile front of the bow. Now, obviously not flat straight to the sea, but it would be angled, but it was still designed in that manner rather than just coming to a particularly fine point. So if you want an example, look at the Daihatsu landing craft that the Japanese used in World War II. You're talking about that kind of bow profile, really. Snowstalker36 asks, who decided that the US standard should be so slow, and why didn't they pick a faster speed? To be fair, at the time, the US standard battle line was not actually particularly slow. They were 21-knot ships, but basically that was the speed of almost everybody else's battle line. Now, if you left the South Carolinas behind, then basically the US battle line, dreadnought battle line that is, could get up to about 21 knots. Maybe some of the earlier 12-inch ships that were subsequent to the South Carolinas would struggle a little bit with that, but all the standards, the Nevadas onwards, could all comfortably make 21 knots. Now, you compare and contrast that to everybody else in World War I, when the standards are being built. The Japanese, granted, theoretically could have a slightly faster battle line if they purely use their 14-inch ships, but they only have 4 of them, plus the Congos. And that's assuming they leave behind the Kawachis and the Satsumas. The British officially also have a 21-knot battle line because that's what the majority of their ships can do. The Germans officially have a 21-knot battle line, but they're in a slightly different boat because the British have a 21-knot official battle line, but a reasonable number of their ships can push a little bit more than that. half a knot in most cases, and of course in the Revenge and Queen Elizabeth classes, somewhat faster still. Whereas for the Germans, they're similar with the South Carolinas in that their very earliest dreadnoughts, like the Nassaus, are actually, and the Helgolands for that matter, are actually somewhat slower. So they're only really a 21-knot battle line if you look at their latest ships. So the US standards sit nicely in the middle of the big fleets of World War I when it comes to overall speed. The reason why they might be perceived as slow going forward, and indeed, admittedly, they were a bit slow by World War II standards, is because the Japanese, their minimum ship by World War II is the Fuso class in terms of battleships, and as mentioned, the Japanese ships are a little bit faster, and they kind of build on that with obviously the Iseis, the Nagatos, the Yamatos, etc. So their overall speed is now a little bit quicker. But of course, the US is building fast battleships as well at this point. The British kind of luck out in that the treaty system, once all is said and done, leaves them with the Revenge and Queen Elizabeth class as their minimum price of entry. The Queen Elizabeth obviously being somewhat quicker. The Revenge class, in theory at least, assuming everybody's engines are in good nick, being just a fraction faster than the US standards. The Germans have had a complete reset, so the only stuff they've got, unless you count the pre-dreadnoughts, is obviously going to be modern, therefore it's going to be faster. And the Italians have refitted their old ships, so all of their stuff is faster. And the French basically have kind of split their battle forces in two. Like, here's the slow stuff and here's the modern, really fast stuff. So, yeah, it's more the fact that there are a lot of US standards still around in World War II, and through various other circumstances, other fleets' average battle line speeds have gone ahead. It's not that they were particularly slow when they were built. When they were built, they were perfectly fine speed-wise. And, of course, back in that period, if you look at kind of a chart of comparative speed, protection, and firepower, certainly World War I period US battleships were very much all about the protection, then the firepower, with speed coming a distant third. Now, obviously, that particular profile of priorities does change a little bit depending on which fast battleship you're looking at the US Navy building, but that's obviously 20 years down the line. Felix B. asks, would the Georgios Averof have stood a chance against a German or Japanese surface raider when it was escorting convoys in the Indian Ocean? Theoretically, yes, Averof would actually have stood a very good chance against most raiders she was likely to encounter, at least on the surface, in the Indian Ocean. Now, she wasn't capable of going particularly quickly. That would have potentially been a bit of an issue, but if she's escorting a convoy, she doesn't necessarily have to. She just has to stick with the convoy and the raider has to come to her. And the thing is, you've got to bear in mind that, yes, she is an armoured cruiser, but she did have an inter-war refit that updated her fire control equipment and so forth. So, yeah, it's not going to be the latest and greatest, but it's going to be serviceable. And when you think about, well, what is she likely to run into? German-wise, Hilfskreuzer, maybe a Deutschland. Against a Hilfskreuzer, she's got more than enough armour to basically laugh at anything Hilfskreuzer can throw at her. And indeed, she came within a few days of actually encountering the Cormoran at one point, and she's got more than enough firepower between her 9.2 and 7.5 inch guns to absolutely rip a Hilfskreuzer to shreds. And even against a Deutschland, while she would be at something of a disadvantage because the Deutschland could run circles around her, she'd be a very tough customer for a Deutschland because she's got armoured cruiser levels of protection. So even the 11-inch guns of a Deutschland class would struggle potentially, especially at longer ranges, because those guns, the 11-inch on the Deutschland specifically, aren't that much more powerful than the guns that you would find on German warships in the First World War. And Averof is actually better protected than some of the British battle cruisers. So, yeah, that could be interesting. And, of course, the 7.5 and 9.2 inch guns more than capable of dishing out the hurt to a Deutschland. And there'd be slightly more of them. I mean, okay, there's only 4 per broadside of each type compared to the 6 11-inch guns of a Deutschland, but combined you've got 8. So you can fire in a salvo of 9.2 inch shells, then a salvo of 7.5s. Depending on the circumstances, you might still give the advantage to the Deutschland, but Averof certainly has the potential, realistically, to very badly hurt or win Deutschland or win a fight in some circumstances. And against the Japanese, it's a slightly different matter. The Japanese don't really go in for the Hilfskreuzer concept. They do try the occasional merchant raider launched in the Indian Ocean, and against that kind of thing, again, Averof would very easily deal with it. But once or twice, of course, the Japanese do venture out in force with their modern heavy cruisers. Those could be a bit more of a problem. Now, of course, Averof's guns are more than capable of hurting the Japanese cruisers very badly. But, of course, the Japanese heavy cruisers have a fair number of guns capable of fairly long-range fire and at somewhat greater amounts of rates of fire than the Deutschland class. And, of course, the Japanese cruisers was a lot faster. So, I mean, if Averof ran into a single Japanese heavy cruiser on a raiding mission, the Japanese ship would have the range and speed advantage, but if it got too close to Averof's guns, then within range of Averof's heavy guns, then it could still be badly hurt, but it would have an advantage. Of course, if there's more than one, which the Japanese could do, then Averof will be on a bit of a hiding to nothing, most likely. But that's also the rarest kind of intrusion. So against the vast majority of things you'd expect poor old Averof to run into, she'd, in the Indian Ocean, be pretty capable against almost all the threats. And that brings us to an end of the Patreon Drydock for this month. It's a little bit shorter than usual, only about 4.5 hours. I think that's partly due to the patrons taking some mercy on the fact that I was over in Japan for the last 3 weeks. And also, I think actually partly due to the fact there's a slightly larger than usual number of alternate history questions that have been asked this time round. So the alternate history segment of the live streams, when we get to this particular Drydock, I think we're just going to have to do this episode as a standalone as opposed to the paired episodes that we've been doing in other areas. In any case, I hope a mere 4.5 hour Patreon Drydock isn't too upsetting for you. And thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.